So let's talk about the keynote today. I met Hilary, called her up, and said, I think the thing that you want to talk about deserves a stage. And the thing that she's going to talk about today is women. And I will tell you, from my personal career and my professional career, women have been some of my biggest advocates, mentors, managers across my entire career. In fact, the top 3 people that I've worked for, 2 of them have been women who have shaped my career, to which I couldn't be more indebted to. I'm also a father with a daughter, which makes things interesting because I completely do not understand how it works. I have a son and a daughter. They are completely different in all of their own right. My daughter is like a spitting image of me, so I should understand it, except I think she does me way better. We've watched girls grow up here. I don't know, is Emily Davis in the room? She's a speaker. She was at the water park party last night. Here she's turning 16. She spoke here. She was on stage in the beginning. She spoke here for 4 years. I swear to God, I'll end up asking her for a job when I'm unable to work down the entrepreneurial track, if you will. And so Hilary's going to get up and she's going to talk about women and how it's had an effect in IT. And I think it's an important story that we all need to think about. I think you need to understand how you build your teams and how you leverage the diversity of people and their ideas and the things that they do, and the examples that we set and the words that we use. It's important for me. This entire conference is built on the fact of being friendly, hugging one another, and creating exposure for people, not just here, but outside of it, whether that's a kid, a lady, a man, it doesn't really matter. So with that, I thought you went into the woods and then disappeared. With that, let's give Hilary the biggest round of applause ever. They're very awake.
Hello. Oh, that was nice. So I did not go to the water park last night, for obvious reasons. But when I first met Clark, he told me this story that he told the other day about the rubber duckies in the filtration system. And that's when I was like, yeah, this is a conference for me. All right, so I'm going to talk, as Clark said, about women. So we'll just get started. Maybe. Oh, there we go. So first, huge thank you to the sponsors. I've never run anything like a conference, but I do co-run the Madison Women in Tech meetup group, and we literally couldn't do anything if we didn't have people providing space or coffee or speakers, and so it's really important to make sure that we show appreciation to these organizations and companies that sponsor something like this. So a little bit about me. I am a former journalist. Right now I work as a full-stack developer in Madison at 10 Forward Consulting. I'm on Twitter a lot, and I tweet about intersectional feminism, puns, and tech. If you don't like puns, I wouldn't recommend sticking around. I don't have any puns today, but just on Twitter. And then, fun fact, has anybody seen Independence Day, right? I can recite his entire pre-battle speech. I don't know why. I didn't set out to memorize it. I just kind of realized one day I had it memorized, and I used to recite it before intramural volleyball games in college to get everybody really pumped up. All right, so we are going to look at 4 kind of categories today, or sections. First, why do we care that there aren't that many women in tech? We're going to look at how computing went from being seen as clerical to cool. And then we're going to look at 3 categories of women who have worked in computing or had an impact in computer science. So first, the ones that are more celebrated that you've probably heard about at some point, ones that are more a little more in the past, still relevant, but are more unsung, and then also a slew of women who are doing really awesome things today that I think everyone should know about. And I should say, there are so many women that I could have included in this presentation, like hundreds. There's no real rhyme or reason for why I picked the ones I did, except that their stories resonated with me for one reason or another, but there's so many I could have included. So if you don't see someone that you really like, it's not personal, it's just, time. And then we're going to look at, okay, well, now we have all this information, what do we do with it? So, who needs women anyway? Why can't everything just look like this? What's wrong with that? I love this quote. This is Elsie Shutt. She was hired in 1953 for the predecessor to NASA. She said, "It really amazed me that these men were programmers, because I thought that was women's work." So these are all things that we either wouldn't have or would look very different if it weren't for the contributions of women in computer science. And we're going to talk about the specific women that contributed to each of these through the program, but I just want you to kind of have this in the back of your head as sort of concrete ways that the world we live in was built on the contributions of women in computer science. So, who needs women anyway? Well, money is a really good reason, right? So, having a diverse company directly impacts a company's bottom line. I've got some statistics to read for you guys. So, 2015 Kinsey report found that ethnically diverse companies are 35% more likely to financially outperform non-diverse companies. There was a 2013 report from the Harvard Business Review that found that diverse companies are 45% more likely to report market share growth and 70% more likely to report that they captured a new market. That's a lot of money that we're talking about. So hiring more women, hiring more people of color actually makes your company more money. Everybody likes that, right? It leads to better software. So I think a lot of us have probably heard about airbags when they first started putting airbags into cars, and it led to a lot of deaths of women and children because the engineers who were building these systems were testing them on themselves, on men of an average build. They weren't testing them for other users, and so that actually caused people to die. More recent examples, we think about facial recognition software that can't recognize people of color, vocal recognition software that literally can't hear women. I mean, these things shouldn't be happening now, and the reason they happened is because we had non-diverse teams building the technology. Kind of going along with that, that same report from Kinsey said that if there is a development team with a team member who is of the client's ethnicity, they're 152% more likely to understand that client's needs. And then raising women raises everyone. So this isn't specifically in tech, but there was a 2014 report, I think from the UN, that said if gender gaps in labor participation, hours worked, and productivity were bridged, the world economy would grow by 26%. That's $28.4 trillion. So we are all losing out because women do not have access to the same opportunities. And last thing is that, these are good jobs, right? So I used to be a journalist. I came into tech for a variety of reasons. I'd started programming as a kid, but one of the reasons was that it paid more. And the hours were better, and the benefits were better, and there were a lot more jobs to be had in the industry. And so these are really good jobs, and women, and especially women of color, deserve access to these really good jobs. So this is another quote I like. This is Dr. Beverly Egalemba, I believe she's from Harvard, and she did a exhaustive study of the women computers at NASA's predecessor. Has anybody seen Hidden Figures? Yeah? If you haven't, you really should. But a lot of her research is what the book Hidden Figures was based on. So anyway, she says, she's explaining why they were doing this. She said, because of the male shortage with the war and the added attractiveness of paying women less, they rather reluctantly began to hire women as computers. It seemed that the more physically attractive a woman was, the more likely she was to get hired. And what really sticks out to me about this quote is that not that much has necessarily changed. So that's fun. All right, so we're going to look at how computing went from clerical to cool. As late as the 1960s, many people perceived computer programming as a natural career choice for savvy young women. So, kind of going back to the idea of Hidden Figures, the original computers were women. This is from historian Nathan Ensberger. He says, programming was considered a low-skill clerical function akin to filing or typing. I don't think many of us here who do programming would agree with that assessment nowadays. But that was what they thought back then. They thought, oh, it's math, it's simple, it's rote, like anyone, even women could do it. That changed in the 1960s, and there were a couple of things that led to this. It started to change, I should say, in the 1960s. One of the ways that changed was they started instituting aptitude tests and personality profiles. So the war ended, they suddenly had a lot more mathematicians coming in who wanted jobs, and they're like, okay, well great, we have to figure out how to narrow the field. These aptitude tests tended to be very math heavy, and one of the ways that this helped to push out women was that men had much greater access to education, especially to advanced education. One of the women we're going to look at in a little bit, she was one of the first African-American women in the US to get her doctorate in math, and I think it was like 1953. So up until that point, women just did not have access to that kind of education. The personality profiles I thought was really fascinating when I was learning about this. So they basically looked at who was programming already, and they thought, well, what kind of traits are leading to their success? And this, I'm going to quote here. They concluded that a disinterest in people and close interactions made a good programmer. So this is where we kind of see the beginning of that, sort of like antisocial programmer, like huddled in their basement typing on their computer in the dark. But they use this personality profile to screen future candidates. And so, generally speaking, women are socialized to be more gregarious, to be more friendly. That's usually how they get ahead in life, especially in this time period. But instead, it was being held against them for these kinds of jobs. PCs, gaming, and the tech genius trope. Has anybody heard of the tech genius trope? Does people know what I'm talking about? A couple people? Okay. So this is basically the idea that we started to see like the boy wonder. So if you think about movies like Weird Science, Revenge of the Nerds, war games where it was someone who could just like type away on a keyboard and they were kind of nerdy, but they were the hero and they got the good-looking woman at the end and everyone loved it. But that was always boys. It was always teenage boys who were in these types of media. PCs started to be targeted towards homes in the 80s, and again, the marketing was all geared at boys. And they were mostly being used for games. And a lot of women like to play games, I'm not saying they don't, but the marketing makes a difference, right? Another thing to think about is there's been numerous studies across various industries that have shown that when the number of men in an industry increases, the pay and the prestige likewise increase. Conversely, when a lot of women enter a field, pay and prestige decrease. So we saw this happen with teaching, which used to be male-dominated, and now teachers get paid like nothing. We saw it with nursing. I mean, there's so many areas where this has happened as the sort of gender balance changes, pay and prestige correlated change. So as more and more men were entering computer science and tech, pay and prestige were increasing, but that also then made it much harder for women to get in because they were better jobs, they could be more picky, and it just perpetuated all of these things that had already been going on. So I have a couple charts, because we like data. So what happened? So this is a chart showing percentage of women who studied a particular major by field. So medical school, law school, physical sciences, and computer science. All of them pretty steadily are trending up until it's about parity, except for computer science, which takes this nosedive. And that nosedive starts in the 80s, where, again, we were talking about, personal computers being marketed to boys, the boy genius idea, and we can see that there's a very clear spot where it just starts to go down. So same thing here, this is a percentage of women specifically in information technology occupations, and then all occupations. In all occupations, the percentage of women in the workforce continues to rise, up to about 47% in 2014. IT trends down. So, and you can see that it was originally rising much sharper than the general occupational force, but even that didn't matter. It stopped, plateaued, and then started to decrease. So we're going to look at women who defied the odds and did it anyway. Ada Lovelace. Who's heard of Ada Lovelace? Right? Yeah. She's kind of a badass. So Ada Lovelace wrote what we consider to be the first computer program. So Charles Babbage had this, it was a calculating machine that he never actually finished, but he had these detailed diagrams and plans. Sorry. And the analytical engine. Thank you. And he was corresponding with her about this, and she just took detailed notes on, oh, well, you could do this, and you can make it better here. And she wrote the first computer program. The big thing that I liked about Ada was that she saw that binary could be more than numbers. So she envisioned using the analytical engine to compose music. She basically saw iTunes before iTunes. This is a quote. She said, "The science of operations, as derived from mathematics more especially, is a science of itself and has its own abstract truth and value." So basically foreseeing the rise of computer science as its own discipline. A couple of fun facts about Ada Lovelace. She was known as the Enchantress of Numbers. And her mother was known as the Princess of Parallelograms. I think if somebody called me the princess of anything, I'd probably get angry, but it was the 1800s. Also, fun fact, Ada Lovelace was a big gambler. She actually wrote she got together with 6 of her buddies and wrote a mathematical model for betting to try and make more money. It was not successful. She actually died deeply in debt, but she tried. Grace Hopper, who's heard of Grace Hopper? A lot of hands, yeah? Yeah, clap, she was great. Let's give her a round of applause. So Grace Hopper, she did have a PhD in mathematics. She was one of the women who made it up to those higher levels. She wrote the first compiler in 1952. She helped create COBOL. There's this great story that I haven't been able to verify if it's actually true, because everything points to the same source, but there's a story that goes that when she was a little girl, she wanted to know how her alarm clock worked. So she took it apart. But then she couldn't get it back together. So she did the same thing to 7 other clocks in the house until her mother finally caught her and stopped her. There's also a story that Grace Hopper is responsible for the term software bug. Again, not entirely sure how accurate that is. There's some who say that that term was in use before she discovered a literal moth in the tubes, but she popularized it if nothing else. Her big thing was that you shouldn't have to be a programmer, you shouldn't have to be trained in computer science to be able to use a computer. And that was her big inspiration for writing this compiler, was trying to add these levels of abstraction to make it easier for regular people to use computers. Another fun fact about her, she was so smart and so dedicated that they had to make 2 different exceptions for her to be in the Navy. The first was that she was physically too small for their regulations. So they had to kind of write her a waiver. And then she aged out of the Navy. I don't remember what the age limit was, but she aged out of the Navy, retired for a couple of years, and then they had to bring her back in because like, we don't know how to do this without you. And so they had to give her a waiver because she was too old to be in the Navy. So she retired at age 79 as a Rear Admiral. Dorothy Vaughan, again, Hidden Figures. She was not the central character in the book and the film, spoiler alert, but I think that her accomplishments, while maybe not as public, were just as important. Something I love, she said, "I changed what I could, and what I couldn't, I endured." She was in charge, the overseer, the supervisor for a lot of these women human computers at NACA, which was the predecessor to NASA. And when they started to bring in electronic computers, she had the foresight to see that this was the future. And if she wanted to be a part of it, no one was going to help her. She was going to have to do it herself. So she trained herself in Fortran, trained all of her human computers in Fortran, and saved their jobs. She was the first black supervisor. They show that in the movie, and that's true. What they don't show in the movie is that when NACA transitioned into NASA and they kind of moved some departments together, she lost that supervisor position, and she never got it back. She was at NASA for almost 30 years, and she never became a supervisor again, despite repeated attempts to try and receive a promotion. She championed other women, both women of color and white women at NASA, because she saw that if they didn't help each other, then really no one was going to give them a leg up. Women of Eniac. Have people heard of Eniac? Couple of people? Okay, that's actually cool because I love this story, so it's exciting that I get to tell it to you guys for maybe the first time. So Eniac was the first all-electronic digital computer. It was a project of the military. It was very secret. There were, I believe it was, well, I can count here, let's see, 6 women who were the programmers for Eniac. And this is not programming like we think of it today. They literally had to move around 3,000 switches and 18,000 vacuum tubes. And so their programming was essentially writing out these sequences of plugs and switches on paper, and then moving around. This is a quote from one of the women, Betty Jennings. She said, "I had a fantastic life. Everything I did was the beginning of something new." And that's something we're going to see a lot with a lot of the women that are being profiled, is this sense of foresight, of seeing ahead, of seeing the potential of computer science. However, this was a classified project. Like I said, it was through the military. When they finally revealed it to the public, so they were building Eniac to compute missile launch trajectories. When they finally revealed it to the public, they had this candlelit dinner full of, luminaries and dignitaries and all of these, brilliant, well-known people. But they didn't invite the women who actually did the programming. The men who got to go built the hardware. At that point, they still thought that the hardware was the tough part of the job, right? Men did the hardware, women did the software. Software was easy, right? The hardware, that was the challenging part. And so the men got to go to this celebratory dinner, and the women trudged home in the snow. Right, now we're going to look at some women who haven't been as celebrated and see what their contributions were. So this is Marjorie Lee Brown. So I mentioned her earlier. She was one of the first black women in the US to get her PhD in mathematics. She procured one of the first computers ever to be used in an academic setting. And that was the school at the time was North Carolina Central University. She encouraged women and students of color to pursue math because she saw that it was a gateway to the future, to all of these wonderful jobs and things that were happening in computer science. Radia Perlman. So she's known as the mother of the internet, and apparently she really hates that title. I've read that she wishes that people would just stop using it, and I'm using it here, so I'm sorry, Radia, but her big thing was spanning tree protocol in 1985, which basically means that you could send information from like a few nodes that were connected at the limited distance to large networks. So the precursor to what we know as the internet. Her mother was a programmer, which I thought was interesting. She said that despite this, her mother didn't really encourage her to go into programming. It wasn't something they talked about a lot, but she felt that just knowing that her mother was a programmer made it seem more attainable, more natural. She's a prolific author and has more than 100 patents. It's pretty impressive. Margaret Hamilton. So she's one of my favorites. I know you're not supposed to have favorites. She's one of my favorites. She wrote onboard flight control software for the Apollo and Skylab missions and coined the term software engineer because she felt like the software folks at NASA were not getting enough respect. Nobody took them seriously. Again, this idea of, well, how hard could it be? And so she wanted to try and put them more on par with all of the other types of engineers at NASA. She did a lot of pioneering work in asynchronous software, priority scheduling, end-to-end testing, and one of my favorite stories about her was, I can't remember which mission it was, but they were getting ready to start the descent sequence, and the computer on board was like freaking out. It was like, there's too much going on, I can't handle all of these things, like I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And she had helped to write the software that allowed it to recognize when this was happening and prioritize certain tasks over others, including the processes necessary to actually like land the space shuttle back on Earth. So probably saved the astronauts' lives. Annie Easley. She worked on one of the first computer programs for navigation in space. So you see that a lot of these women were working for NASA, or its predecessor, NACA, and that was really, despite the conditions that they might have been dealing with, it was still one of the best ways for them to have access to these types of machines and to really, to find careers within computer science. Kind of following along with a lot of the women we've talked about, Annie Easley didn't just focus on herself and her career and what she could do for her life, but really tried to help those around her. She grew up in, I want to say it was rural Mississippi, and she would go home and she used her education to teach her neighbors how to pass the Jim Crow voting test so that they could still vote. If I can't work with you, I will work around you. So kind of, again, the same thing Dorothy Vaughan was saying, like, I changed what I could, what I couldn't, I just put up with. Dr. Erna Schneider Hoover, which is a really fun name to say. She received one of the first ever patents for software. She was working at Bell Labs at the time. She was, they were having issues with overload when too many people would try to call at the same time. And so her patent was for monitoring all of the incoming calls and then automatically adjusting the acceptance rate to avoid this overload. She conceived this idea while in the hospital, recovering from the birth of her first child. Karen Spark Jones. I love this quote. "Computing is too important to be left to men." She pioneered this idea of inverse document frequency, which, to be honest, I had no idea what that was. It turns out that's used in search engines, including Google, to rank pages and documents based on the search term. So we have Karen Spark Jones to thank for how awesome it is to be able to find pictures of cats in baskets on the internet. Her big thing, kind of like what Grace Hopper was saying, she wanted real people to be able to use computers. So she tried to she wanted computers to work in a way that you could give them English instead of having to give them equations. Mary Kenneth Keller, she's another one of my favorites. She had the first doctorate ever in computer science in the US. She actually got it the same day as a man, but still, one of the first ever to get a computer science doctorate in the US. She helped develop BASIC, and kind of like Grace Hopper had to have these exceptions so that they could, make use of her brilliance. BASIC was developed at Dartmouth, and before Mary Kenneth Keller became part of the project, they actually barred women from the computer lab. They had to make a special exception. They were forced to relax their rule so that she could participate in the project. Fun fact, she got her doctorate at UW-Madison. Yeah, pretty cool. She said, this is something that I think she said this in 60-something. She said, "We're having an information explosion. And it's certainly obvious that information is of no use unless it's available." And this is back in the 60s. Like, you couldn't do anything with computers, right? But again, she saw the potential, and she wanted to be a part of getting it there. All right, so now we're going to look at some women who are doing really awesome things right now in the field of computer science. Corinne Yu. So I don't even know where to start with her. I mean, just look at this list. Game programmer for Apple II, space shuttle program coder. She's a patent for lighting work on Halo 4. And oh yeah, now she programs Amazon drones. Like you do. Sophie Wilson. So she designed the Acorn System 1 in 1979, which I need to tell you about this. So Acorn System 1, if people don't know, it's a microcomputer. It had 512 bytes of memory. And that was like, whoa. Also, she built it while she was still an undergrad. The other big thing that she contributed was the ARM processor core. So this is used in smartphones, tablets, digital TVs, gaming. I read the other day that more than 30 billion ARM processor cores have been shipped in the world, or that's 4 for every human on Earth. And we have Sophie Wilson to thank for that. She faced multiple levels of otherness within tech because Sophie Wilson she's also trans, and so she had to deal with more than just being a woman. Similar to how a lot of the women we've talked about are women of color who had these additional layers of obstacle put in their way. Wendell Snyder, she literally wrote the book on threat modeling. She's been described as sheriff for the internet. She currently works at Fastly, which relays data all over the world for companies like Yelp, Kickstarter, Stripe, Pinterest. Her job is to make sure that that data is being sent securely. So you have her to thank for not getting hacked. And again, impressive resumes, worked at Microsoft, Mozilla, Apple, just doing really amazing things. Tracy Chu, she created a movement to collect and publish tech diversity data. So the story goes, she was on a plane from San Francisco to, I want to say, Seattle for a conference. And she was looking around at the plane. She kind of thought to herself, if this plane goes down, that's half of the women in Silicon Valley. And then she was like, that's half the women in Silicon Valley. And so she was tired of all of this talk about diversity, right? Like, oh, we need to be more diverse. We're going to do things. We're going to make effort. We're going to have these programs. But there was no data on any of these efforts and how effective they were or were not being. And so she wanted to change that. So she started a spreadsheet. Very simple. Started a spreadsheet and invited companies to share their information. So I checked pretty recently, and there were 268 companies who are utilizing this spreadsheet, and it's the percentage of it's like their gender breakdown, their ethnic breakdown, trying to track this data to see, like, are things actually getting better? Companies who are utilizing include GitHub, Wells Fargo, BendyWorks out of Madison is on there, Tinder. So if you ever wondered Tinder's gender breakdown, you can find out. She is really good at picking companies. So she was one of the early employees at Quora, which is huge now. She was the number 8 employee at Pinterest, which now has more than 500 employees. So she's currently focusing on freelance and consulting right now, but the next company that she goes to work for is like, I think we should pay attention. So Sara Mae, she is a co-founder of Railsbridge. Have people heard of Railsbridge? A couple people? So it's a great program. I think they've served more than 10,000 people. And it's free day-long workshops to teach Rails. And they focus on communities that are underrepresented in tech. And Railsbridge has been so successful that they built Bridge Foundry, which is, the goal is to sort of repackage the Railsbridge setup for other languages. So I can't remember which languages are trying out the Bridge model now, but I know there are at least 2 others that have kind of taken this idea and are trying to implement it within their own communities. She's a prolific speaker, and she's also one of the main organizers for RailsConf and RubyConf, and writes really good blog posts. I definitely recommend checking out her blog. Erica Baker. So she was in the news recently. She moved from Slack to Kickstarter. She's director of engineering at Kickstarter. And she kind of came to public prominence because of a spreadsheet. She was like hanging out with coworkers at Google, where she'd been for about 6 years, and they were just having some wine and talking about work, and realized that they all made vastly different sums of money, even though they all were like relatively similar positions. And they thought, well, that's pretty weird. I wonder if it's just us, if this is an anomaly, or if this is true across the board. So Erica Baker created a spreadsheet, sent it to some of her friends at Google, and just said, hey, do you mind anonymously filling out, your position and what you make and any side benefits you get? And it swept like wildfire through the company, and it was just, tons and tons and tons of people were adding their information. And now it is 100% legal to talk about salary in the US, right? You cannot be punished for talking about your salary. Of course, that didn't really matter. She was basically driven to quit. So things happened, like her manager kept giving her bad performance reviews. They have this system of like employee bonuses, sort of. So like employees can nominate you for like a small bonus. And I think, and managers can turn those down, but she said it very rarely happened. And so a bunch of her coworkers were sending this like small bonus her way in appreciation for this spreadsheet and what she had done, and the managers kept denying them for no reason. So she left, went to Slack, and at Slack her job was 20% like diversity and outreach work. So you can see how she was treated very differently at those 2 different companies. And it's interesting now, especially with everything going on with Google, with the National Labor Board, and looking into the wage gap among gender. And it doesn't surprise me knowing how they reacted to her initial attempt to try and, get to the root of the problem. I can't turn off my black. So again, talking about how a lot of women in computer science are dealing with sort of multiple ways that they are othered within our community. Project Include is this really awesome project that she's been a part of, along with, I think Tracy Chu is working on it, Ellen Powell, and the idea is to accelerate diversity and inclusion solutions in tech, and they use a lot of data, not surprisingly, given the women who are running it. Probably going to say this wrong, and I apologize. Yoki Matsuka. She was one of the 3 founding members of Google X. As I understand, they actually reached out to her and asked her to be a part of it. This was before anyone, even at Google, knew what Google X was. So think self-driving cars, Google Glass, all of that comes out of Google X. She moved to Nest. She was one of the main developers on their thermostat program. And then she left and went to Ross for a little while, and then recently came back as their chief technical officer. She's also literally a genius. So, and then Parisa Tabriz. So we talked earlier about how Ada Lovelace, was known as the enchantress of numbers, and her mother was the princess of parallelograms. Parisa Tabriz calls herself a browser boss, and I think she used to be security princess. This is actually on her LinkedIn, what she calls herself. Her official title is engineering director for Google Chrome, but I really love the idea of browser boss. Before she became the engineering director, she was in charge of the security, and she headed up a team of about 30 hackers whose job was just to try and break things so that they could improve the security of Google Chrome. And I think it's fascinating that she has gotten so far and is doing such good work when she grew up without a computer. Right, we hear a lot about, even the keynote the other day was, had a computer when they were young, were exposed to it at an early age. She had never used a computer, basically had never used a computer until she got to college. All right, so we've heard about all of these awesome women. We know more about why there are fewer women in computer science to begin with, and kind of how that shift happened, that changed. But what do we do now? So there's 3 different things that we can do. The first thing we can do is amplify. So a really simple way to keep informed about women doing great things in tech is to follow them on Twitter. I created a Twitter list that you can find there that I'm always adding to, and if people have suggestions, I'd love to add them, but it's just really cool women in tech who are on Twitter and tweet about being women in tech and the cool things that they do. Organize a Wikipedia edit-a-thon. So putting together this presentation, I'm sure you've seen the little footnotes everywhere, and I've got a bunch of citations at the end. But it was really hard to find information about a lot of these women. It's just not readily accessible. And so one idea is that I want to do with our Women in Tech group in Madison is a Wikipedia edit-a-thon. So adding information to Wikipedia articles for these women if they're sparse, or creating articles for the women where they don't exist, and just kind of helping make it a lot easier to find information about these really cool women doing awesome things in tech. Attend talks and panels featuring women, host talks and panels featuring women, especially on topics that are not about being women in tech. It's important to talk about, but I think most of the panels that I've been on, or that I've been asked to be on, it's a panel about being women in tech, and it's there's a lot more that women in tech can talk about, literally everything in tech, women in tech can talk about. So, true story. And use your power. So both of the other keynote speakers talked about privilege, right? And the privilege that they have as being sort of what we consider the norm in tech. And I was talking with someone at one of the open spaces the other day, and he was saying, I don't really know what I can do to fix things. If I see something that isn't right, I'm worried that I'll be punished, or that I won't be taken seriously. How can I help with this problem? And actually, research has shown that if a member of a minority group advocates, even for a different minority group in the workplace, they're viewed as a troublemaker, right? A complainer. If someone from the majority group advocates for a minority group, they're seen as like an upstanding citizen, right? Like, oh, well, look at that. Like, John really cares about his colleagues. Like, what a virtuous person. So you have more power than you think, is kind of where that goes. Okay, support is also super important. We're going to talk about two different types of support. First, community support. So how can you support the greater community of women and people of color in tech in your area? Back or attend local women in tech groups. So I talked earlier when we were talking about sponsors, and a lot of local groups don't need much, right? We don't need financial backing. We just need space, maybe coffee, water. If there's no coffee, that's fine. It's amazing how just providing a space can make a really big difference to a lot of the groups that are trying to do advocacy work for women and people of color in tech. Volunteer at a boot camp. So nationally, the average for the gender breakdown for boot camps is that 38% of students are women. And at traditional four-year colleges, it's like 17. So they're doing something right. There's lots of boot camps all over. Find one, dedicate a few hours, mentor, spread word about it, just do something to help promote that. After-school programs do a lot to get girls in tech. There's 3 or 4 different ones in Madison alone, but there's YWCA often does things, the Girl Scouts, Girls and Boys Club. Find where things are happening at an earlier age, because studies have shown that by 3rd or 4th grade, girls are already buying into these ideas of gender stereotypes about STEM and math. So, got to start early. And then mentoring is really important. So there was a survey that came out this past March of 500 women who work in tech around the world. And they asked them, what is your biggest barrier to continuing in tech? 48% of them said lack of female mentors. 42% said lack of female role models. So mentoring is important, and I don't think you have to be a woman to mentor women in tech. I think clearly that helps, that's important, but I think just reaching out at all can make a big difference. How do you support women who are already at your company? So structured opportunities for two-way feedback is important. I was just talking with someone this morning over breakfast, and he attended, I think it was Heather's presentation about how to teach. And she was saying that no feedback is negative feedback. So you might think that, well, maybe I don't, outwardly give like positive feedback, or not. I don't deliberately give positive feedback, but I'm not saying bad things. And it's like, that doesn't matter. If you don't say anything, people assume that it's negative. So providing these opportunities for two-way feedback is really important to make people feel, to build trust and make them feel like they're actually a part of the organization. Hosting a range of events is important. So being careful not to assume that everyone is interested in virtual reality or everyone is interested in Golden Girls marathons, although both are pretty great. Just really providing space for people to feel like their interests are valid or are valuable, and not just kind of going with a default. Collect data and be transparent about it. This is huge. It's one thing to say that you want your company to be more diverse or that you want to support diversity initiatives, but it's another thing to publicly commit to it by saying, here are the numbers we had this year, here is a specific goal we would like to reach, here's how we plan to do it, and just making it so you can be held accountable. Sorry. This one's all, make them feel valued. It's very important. These kinds of things all contribute to that. But if people don't feel, especially people who are already feeling othered, whether it's because of their ethnicity, their religion, their gender, if they're already feeling like they're on the outside, if you don't make specific effort to make them feel valued and a part of the team, they're not going to stay. Last one, hire women. And I know some people are probably thinking like, that's really hard, and it's like, it's true, but here are some things that can help. So actions speak louder than words, right? Part of it is, if you're having trouble hiring women, if you feel like you've been making a good faith effort to hire more women or people of color at your company and you're not making progress, maybe you haven't demonstrated in a public enough way that your company deserves women and people of color. And what I say by that is, so one of the things that drew me to my current company, 10 Forward in Madison, was when I had my interview, I said, what are you doing for diversity issues? You know, how are you showing that you care about these things? Because that was really important to me as a woman in tech. And they could give me a list of things that they did. And they were clearly very supportive of it, and they followed through on that, and that's really important. And so there are companies where maybe the work wouldn't be exactly what I wanted, or maybe the pay is kind of low, but if they're actually doing the work of increasing diversity, that makes a big difference. Study your biases. So if you go to the citations after this, I have a link to the slides. There's a lot of great resources on what kind of biases exist and how you can work with them. So one thing I want to talk about, there's this 2014 study that found that managers, this is men and women managers, are twice as likely to hire a man as a woman with identical test results. So they gave them a test, and then they presented the results to these managers, and they were twice as likely to hire men as women. And this includes women, because this is all ingrained in us, right? It's not like somebody is sitting there saying, like, well, you should hire men. You know, men are better than women. Well, the Google guy was, but but it's something we don't even think about, and that's what makes it dangerous. Similarly, there is this 2013 Yale study that people might have heard about. They had identical resumes, like literally the exact same resume. It was for STEM positions. And they just changed the name from Jennifer to John. And they randomly gave these out to people who were hiring for lab positions. And they found that the women's resume, again, same content, was consistently ranked less competent, less hireable, and they said that they were less willing to mentor them than the man's. Same resume. They also offered them on average, they offered the Jennifer, on average, $4,000 less than John. So we wonder where the wage gap comes from. That's part of it. And then finally, there is this 2004 Harvard study, similar concept, identical resumes, but they changed the name not by gender, but with what we would consider to be more like white-sounding names and more African-American sounding names. And they found that the white-sounding names were 50% more likely to get a callback for the job than African-American sounding names. So these are things we might not even be aware of, but they're real and they're happening even to those of us with the best intentions. And if we don't know that these are factoring subconsciously into our decisions, we can't account for them and start to actually make change. Re-examine your hiring practices. So this is a big one. If you have been in the position where you've been posting a job and it's been open and you're just not getting women or people of color to even apply, it's easy to think like, oh, well, there just aren't any, right? They all have jobs, or there aren't any in my community, or something along those lines. But it just means you're looking in the wrong places, or you need to completely restructure how you're looking. So, a big thing with women, generally speaking, is studies have shown that women don't apply for a job unless they meet at least 90 or 95% of the listed qualifications. Whereas men will meet half and be like, yeah, totally, I'm fit for this, I'll apply for it. And so, you have to think about how you tailor your job listing. Like, only list what you actually need. Another way to do this is to look at your compensation and your benefits. Do you mention family leave? Do you offer family leave? Because that's important to a lot of women. Do you talk about, are you talking about work-life balance at the top, or are you talking about your kegerator at the top? And we have a kegerator at our co-working space, and it's great. But again, to a lot of people, that's a red flag. And again, in the resources, there's a lot of information about about more in depth on some of this stuff. And really, if it were easy, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? Like, that's the whole point. If it were easy to hire women and people of color, then we wouldn't be sitting at like 20% for women in the tech industry. So in summary, again, computing is too important to be left to white men. Y'all are great, but like, real solutions are going to come from everyone being a part of the conversation and contributing to figure out what we need and how to solve it. So, go out there and amplify, support, and hire women and people of color. Thank you.